Silver Plume, Colorado, a quiet mountain town where silence stretches for miles. In the summer of 1988, a writer came here searching for clarity and vanished into the Rockies without a trace. High in the Rocky Mountains west of Denver, Silver Plume sits at an elevation where the air thins and sound seems to disappear. It is a town defined not by movement, but by stillness. Old wooden buildings line a narrow road that once carried miners and freight trains, and beyond those structures rise steep slopes of pine, rock, and shadow. In this place, the mountains do not announce themselves, they simply wait. In July of 1988, Silver Plume was home to fewer than 200 residents. Everyone knew who belonged. Outsiders were noticed immediately, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. People came here for a reason: to escape noise, to retreat from crowded lives, to disappear into thought. For some, it was a temporary refuge; for others, a permanent withdrawal. That summer, one such outsider arrived quietly and without ceremony. His name was Keith Reinhard. He was 31 years old, a writer, an intellectual, a man who had recently left behind his former life in Chicago and come west in search of something he had not yet defined. Keith did not arrive announcing plans or intentions. He rented a small room in town. He walked alone. He read, wrote, and observed. He blended into the rhythm of Silver Plume with surprising ease, becoming a familiar but distant presence, the quiet man who kept mostly to himself, who spent long hours thinking, who seemed comfortable with solitude. Nothing about his arrival suggested urgency. Nothing about his demeanor suggested distress. He was not fleeing danger. He was not hiding from anyone. By all outward appearances, he was simply a man attempting to rebuild his inner life in a place where the world felt stripped down to essentials. Silver Plume, however, is not just quiet. It is isolating in ways that are easy to underestimate. Beyond the few streets of town, the terrain rises sharply into dense forest and exposed rock. Trails fade quickly. Weather shifts without warning. Distances that appear manageable from a roadside viewpoint become deceptive once entered on foot. In these mountains, perspective can vanish as completely as sound. On July 31, 1988, Keith Reinhard disappeared. There was no dramatic scene, no witnesses reporting panic or confusion, no cries echoing through the valley. He did not leave behind a note explaining his intentions. He did not pack his belongings or settle his affairs. His car remained where it had been parked. His personal items stayed behind, untouched. One day he was there, a solitary figure walking the streets of a mountain town. The next, he was gone. At first, there was no immediate alarm. In a place like Silver Plume, solitude is expected. People come and go. Days pass without interaction. But as hours turned into days, concern slowly took shape. The absence began to feel wrong. The silence around his disappearance grew heavier. What followed would become one of Colorado's most enduring mysteries, a case defined not by clues, but by their absence. No confirmed trail, no physical evidence, no definitive explanation. Despite searches, investigations, and decades of speculation, Keith Reinhard was never found. His disappearance would challenge assumptions about wilderness survival, voluntary disappearance, and the limits of investigation in remote terrain. It would raise questions about how completely a person can vanish, even in the modern world. And it would leave behind a story that refuses to resolve itself into a single, satisfying answer. This is not a story of spectacle or violence. It is a story of quiet decisions, open landscapes, and unanswered questions. A story rooted in documented fact, shaped by what is known and defined by what is not. In the sections that follow, this documentary will trace Keith Reinhard's life, his journey west, his days in Silver Plume, and the investigation that unfolded after he vanished. It will examine the theories that were considered, the searches that turned up nothing, and the reasons this case ultimately went cold. But it begins here, in a mountain town where silence stretches for miles, and where one man stepped into the wilderness and was never seen again. Before Keith Reinhard disappeared into the mountains of Colorado, he lived a life shaped not by instability or chaos, but by thought, intention, and intellectual ambition. To understand the mystery of his disappearance, it is necessary first to understand the man himself, not as a symbol or a theory, but as a documented human being whose life left a clear record. Keith Reinhard was 31 years old in the summer of 1988. He was known primarily as a writer, but that label alone does not fully capture who he was. Keith was deeply introspective, academically inclined, and intensely self-aware. Friends and acquaintances described him as thoughtful and analytical, someone who engaged seriously with ideas and personal meaning rather than surface-level ambition. He had lived in Chicago, where he moved within literary and intellectual circles. His interests were not casual or passing. He read widely, thought deeply, and wrote with discipline. Writing, for Keith, was not simply a career aspiration. It was a way of understanding himself and the world around him. His work reflected a mind that was searching, not for attention or fame, but for clarity and purpose. Those who knew him did not describe recklessness or impulsivity. There is no public record suggesting substance abuse, criminal involvement, or violent behavior. He was not known to place himself deliberately in dangerous situations. His personality leaned inward rather than outward. He was private, reserved, and contemplative. At the same time, Keith was not isolated from society in a dysfunctional sense. He maintained relationships. He communicated clearly. He made plans. There was no documented history of severe mental illness, institutionalization, or erratic behavior that would suggest a break from reality. While he was introspective, he was also grounded. What did stand out was a growing dissatisfaction with the life he had been living. Friends later recalled that Keith felt constrained, not by people, but by expectations. The routines of city life, the pressures of productivity, and the constant noise of urban existence weighed on him. This was not a sudden crisis. It was a gradual realization that something fundamental was missing. Keith's search was philosophical rather than escapist. He was not attempting to disappear. He was attempting to realign his life with his values. That distinction matters because it frames his later choices not as desperation, but as intention. He was especially drawn to ideas of solitude and self-examination. He believed that distance from distraction could sharpen thought and deepen understanding. This belief was not unusual among writers or thinkers, but Keith took it seriously enough to act on it in a meaningful way. Importantly, there is no evidence that he expressed fear, paranoia, or a desire to sever all ties. He did not give away possessions. He did not erase his identity. He did not communicate any intent to vanish permanently. Instead, his actions suggest a man stepping away temporarily to think, write, and reassess. This balance between stability and dissatisfaction defines Keith Reinhard as a person. He was neither a drifter nor a runaway. He was a man in transition, attempting to resolve an internal question rather than flee an external threat. That internal search would eventually take him west, away from Chicago, toward the mountains of Colorado. But at the time he left, nothing in his background suggested that the journey would end in mystery. There were no warning signs, no dramatic declarations, no sense, in hindsight, that his life was unraveling. Keith Reinhard was a functioning adult, making a deliberate choice to step into solitude, believing, as many have before him, that distance from the world could bring him closer to himself.
What no one could have known then was that this search for meaning would lead not to clarity, but to disappearance. When Keith Reinhard left Chicago, it was not an act of escape in the dramatic sense, nor was it a sudden rupture from his past. It was a deliberate withdrawal, measured, thoughtful, and consistent with the way he approached most decisions in his life. Chicago had offered Keith structure, access, and intellectual stimulation. It was a city where writers could find communities, conversations, and opportunities. For years, he had lived within that environment, engaging with ideas and people who shared his interests. Yet over time, the city began to feel less like a source of energy and more like a constant interruption. Friends later described Keith as increasingly disillusioned with the rhythms of urban life, the noise, the schedules, the sense that every day was shaped by obligations that left little room for reflection. This was not burnout in the conventional sense. Keith was not overwhelmed by work or pressure. Instead, he felt crowded by proximity, by too many voices, too many expectations, too many distractions pulling attention away from deeper thought. There is no record of conflict that forced him to leave, no documented professional failure, no personal crisis that demanded distance. What emerges instead is a picture of someone who believed that clarity required removal, that understanding himself and his writing demanded silence rather than stimulation. Keith had long been drawn to the idea of retreat as a creative tool. The notion that solitude could strip life down to essentials was not new to him. Writers before him had sought isolation to sharpen their work, to listen more closely to their own thinking. Keith saw himself within that tradition, not as someone abandoning the world, but as someone temporarily stepping outside it. His decision to move west reflected that philosophy. Colorado, with its vast open spaces and small mountain towns, represented the opposite of Chicago in nearly every way. Fewer people, fewer structures, fewer interruptions. The mountains offered scale and silence, an environment where days could pass without imposed urgency. Importantly, Keith did not sever communication when he left. He did not vanish socially. He made arrangements. He relocated deliberately. He did not conceal his destination or intentions. This was not the behavior of someone attempting to erase themselves. The move was also not framed as a permanent departure. There is no evidence that Keith described it as a final departure from his former life. Instead, it appears he viewed it as a period of recalibration, time to think, to write, to examine what direction his life should take next. Colorado was not chosen at random. Keith was aware of the state's reputation for isolation and natural beauty. Small towns in the Rockies had long attracted people seeking privacy and simplicity, places where anonymity was possible without complete disappearance, places where solitude did not require explanation. When Keith arrived in Colorado, he did not immediately isolate himself deep in the wilderness. He chose a town, Silver Plume, that allowed proximity to others while still offering distance from urban intensity. This choice suggests balance rather than extremity. He wanted quiet, not abandonment. From an investigative standpoint, Keith's departure from Chicago raised no immediate concerns. There were no reports of distress, no expressions of fear, no behaviors that would later stand out as warning signs. In fact, his move aligned logically with his personality and values. That context matters because it shapes how his disappearance would later be interpreted. Keith did not leave Chicago to disappear. He left to understand himself better. The journey west was an intentional act of self-examination, not a prelude to vanishing. Yet intention does not control outcome, and once Keith stepped into the mountains, the environment he sought for clarity would become the setting of unanswered questions. The move that was meant to simplify his life would ultimately complicate it beyond resolution, transforming a thoughtful retreat into a mystery that remains unresolved decades later.
Silver Plume, Colorado is not the kind of place people pass through by accident. Tucked into Clear Creek Canyon along Interstate 70, the town sits at roughly 9,000 feet above sea level, surrounded on all sides by steep mountain slopes and dense forest. The road that leads in is the same road that leads out. Beyond that narrow corridor, the landscape rises sharply into terrain that resists easy travel and quick understanding. Founded in the 19th century during Colorado's mining boom, Silver Plume had long since settled into quiet by the late 1980s. The mines were closed, the population was small, the pace of life was slow and largely unchanged by modern urgency. Fewer than 200 residents lived there year-round, and most of them knew each other by name. The town itself consisted of a short main street, a handful of historic buildings, and residential structures scattered along the valley floor. There were no sprawling neighborhoods, no complex street grids. At night, darkness arrived quickly and completely. Artificial light was limited. Sound did not carry far. The mountains absorbed it. What surrounded Silver Plume was far more imposing than what lay within it. Just beyond the last buildings, the terrain shifted abruptly. Forests grew dense, slopes steepened, rock outcroppings interrupted the tree line. Trails, where they existed, were informal and often unmarked. Venturing even a short distance off established paths could quickly lead into disorientation. This environment is deceptive. From town, the mountains appear manageable, rather than threatening. Peaks rise cleanly against the sky, distances look short. But once entered on foot, the landscape reveals its scale. Elevation affects breathing. Weather shifts without warning. Fog can roll in suddenly, obscuring landmarks. Temperature drops quickly after sunset, even in summer. Search and rescue experts have long documented how mountainous terrain complicates disappearances. Footprints vanish on rock. Scent trails dissipate in thin air. Dense vegetation hides ground-level visibility. A person can move only a short distance and become effectively invisible. In Silver Plume, these conditions are intensified by isolation. Emergency response is limited by geography. There are fewer roads, fewer access points, and fewer vantage positions from which to search. Even with coordinated efforts, large areas remain difficult to cover thoroughly. This context is critical to understanding why disappearances near Silver Plume are uniquely difficult to resolve. Unlike urban environments, where witnesses, cameras, and physical infrastructure create layers of documentation, wilderness offers none of those safeguards. It keeps its own record, one that is not easily read. For someone like Keith Reinhard, Silver Plume offered exactly what he was seeking. It provided solitude without complete abandonment, silence without absolute isolation. He could live among people while remaining mentally removed from urban life. He could walk alone without drawing attention. He could think. At the same time, the town's environment demanded respect. Even locals understood the risks of venturing into the surrounding mountains without preparation. Sudden storms, steep drop-offs, and disorienting terrain were not abstract dangers, they were daily realities. Keith was not an experienced mountaineer, nor was he documented as someone who frequently undertook technical hikes. He was, by all accounts, a walker, someone who moved through landscapes for thought rather than challenge. That distinction would later become significant. Silver Plume does not announce its dangers. It does not warn visitors with signs or barriers. It simply exists as it always has, quiet, expansive, and indifferent to intention. People can live there peacefully for decades. Others can step too far, too casually, and vanish. When Keith chose Silver Plume, he chose a place where disappearance was possible, not because of malice, but because of geography. A place where the line between presence and absence is thin, and once crossed, That line is not easily retraced.
During the weeks Keith Reinhard spent in Silver Plume, his daily life unfolded quietly and predictably, shaped by routine rather than risk. There were no dramatic changes in behavior, no signs of agitation, and no indications that he believed himself to be in danger. To the people around him, he appeared calm, deliberate, and settled into the environment he had chosen. Keith lived simply. He rented a small room in town, modest and functional, consistent with someone focused more on thought than comfort. His possessions were few: books, writing materials, personal clothing. Nothing suggested preparation for extended wilderness travel or sudden departure. Keith spent much of his time alone, but not in a way that alarmed anyone. Solitude was common in Silver Plume, and his behavior fit the town's rhythm. He was often seen walking, sometimes along the road, sometimes near the edges of town, moving at an unhurried pace. These walks appeared contemplative rather than exploratory. He did not carry visible hiking gear or supplies. He did not announce destinations. When he interacted with locals, the exchanges were ordinary and unremarkable. He spoke politely. He paid his bills. He made no statements about leaving suddenly or embarking on dangerous journeys. There were no reported arguments, confrontations, or emotional outbursts, nothing that would later stand out as a warning sign. Keith was known to spend time reading and writing. Writing, for him, was a disciplined practice rather than a spontaneous impulse. His days followed a quiet internal structure: time to think, time to write, time to walk. This pattern remained consistent throughout his stay. Importantly, there was no indication that Keith was struggling physically or mentally in a way that concerned others. He did not appear disoriented or confused. He did not express fear or paranoia. While introspective, he remained coherent and purposeful. He did not speak openly about plans to leave Silver Plume, nor did he express dissatisfaction with being there. If anything, the town seemed to provide exactly what he had sought: distance from noise, space for reflection, and a pace of life that allowed uninterrupted thought. From an investigative standpoint, Keith's routine is notable for its normalcy. Many disappearances are preceded by behavioral changes, sudden withdrawals, erratic actions, or explicit statements of distress. None of those were present here. His days did not escalate toward crisis. They simply continued, quietly, until they stopped. Keith also did not establish deep ties that might have anchored him socially in town, but this was not unusual for a short-term resident. He remained courteous but private, known but not closely known, familiar but not examined. This balance, visible but distant, would later complicate the investigation. There were people who recognized him, but few who could speak in detail about his inner state during his final days. His privacy, which had served him well as a writer, now limited insight into his final intentions. What stands out most about Keith's daily life in Colorado is how little it explains what happened next. There were no signals pointing toward disappearance, no documented preparations, no emotional farewell, no evidence of fear or urgency. He lived as he intended, quietly, thoughtfully, without drawing attention, and then, without disruption or announcement, that routine ended. The absence of warning would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case because it left investigators with no clear moment where normal life gave way to mystery, only a quiet pattern, suddenly broken.
The final confirmed sightings of Keith Reinhard are few, precise, and strikingly ordinary. There is no dramatic final encounter, no urgent exchange, no moment that suggested he was about to disappear. Instead, the record ends quietly, as if his presence simply faded out of view. On July 31, 1988, Keith Reinhard was seen in Silver Plume going about his day in a manner consistent with his established routine. Witnesses later recalled seeing him walking alone in town. He appeared calm. He was not running, arguing, or behaving erratically. Nothing about his posture or demeanor suggested distress or confusion. Accounts describe him wearing ordinary clothing suitable for a casual walk, not specialized gear for a long hike or overnight excursion. He did not appear burdened with supplies. There were no backpacks reported, no heavy equipment, no indications that he was preparing to spend extended time in the wilderness. These details matter because they establish boundaries around his intentions, at least as far as they were externally visible. Keith did not look like someone embarking on a deliberate disappearance or a planned survival trick. He looked like a man stepping out for a walk. The exact direction he took after those sightings has never been conclusively determined. Some reports suggest he was last seen heading toward the outskirts of town, where paved roads give way to trails and uneven terrain. But no witness could confirm a specific destination. No one followed him. No one noted a time when he failed to return. In Silver Plume, this lack of immediate concern was not unusual. Residents were accustomed to solitude. People walked alone. They disappeared into their routines and re-emerged later. Hours, even a full day, could pass without contact and still be considered normal. Keith's car remained parked where it had been. This would later become a critical detail. It suggested that he had not left town by vehicle and had not made plans to travel elsewhere. His room was undisturbed. His belongings were still there. There was no sign of packing or preparation for departure. No note was found, no written indication of his intentions. For a writer, this absence would later feel particularly unsettling to those who examined the case. Keith was someone who processed his thoughts through language, yet he left behind no explanation. The timeline narrows to a small window. At some point after being seen walking, Keith Reinhard vanished. Not over weeks, not gradually. Within a span of hours, he went from present to absent. There were no reports of screams, accidents, or unusual activity in town that day. No one recalled hearing anything that stood out. The mountains did not announce what they might have taken. When concern eventually grew and people realized Keith had not returned, there was already a gap, a stretch of time during which anything could have happened and nothing was observed. That gap would become the defining feature of the case. From an investigative perspective, the last confirmed sightings establish only one certainty. Keith was alive, calm, and unremarkable shortly before he disappeared. Everything after that point is inference, reconstruction, and unanswered possibility. There is no confirmed moment of crisis, no last known words, no final destination. Just a man walking, and then nothing. The absence of drama in those final sightings is what makes them so haunting. Keith Reinhard did not vanish in the midst of chaos. He vanished during an ordinary day, in a quiet town, under clear observation, and still left no trace behind.
July 31st, 1988, began in Silver Plume like countless other summer days. The town moved slowly, governed by routine rather than urgency. There was nothing about the morning that suggested it would become a dividing line, a before and an after in the life of Keith Reinhard. Keith Reinhard did not announce plans that day. He did not tell anyone he was leaving town or heading into the mountains. There were no preparations that would later stand out as intentional or unusual. His behavior remained consistent with the quiet pattern he had maintained since arriving. At some point, he left his room and went out on foot. This, in itself, was not remarkable. Keith often walked alone. He used walking as a way to think, to organize his thoughts, to inhabit the landscape without engaging with it directly. Locals were accustomed to seeing him pass by without conversation. What distinguishes this day is not what happened, but what did not. Keith did not return. As the day progressed, there was no immediate alarm. In Silver Plume, absence did not automatically signal danger.
People were used to solitude. It was entirely possible for someone to spend hours, even an entire day, without being seen. But as time passed, small inconsistencies began to surface. Keith's car remained parked and unmoved. Lights in his room stayed off. No one recalled seeing him again. There were no signs that he had left town with anyone else or accepted a ride. When concern eventually turned into recognition, it became clear that Keith had left behind everything he would need for a planned departure. His personal belongings were still in his room: clothing, books, writing materials, all untouched. There was no evidence that he had gathered supplies or prepared for an extended absence. Most notably, there was no note. For someone whose life revolved around writing and reflection, this silence was deeply unsettling. Keith had not left behind a final explanation, a plan, or even a fragment of thought. There was nothing that could be interpreted as a goodbye or a deliberate severing of ties. His car's presence reinforced the mystery. If Keith had intended to leave Silver Plume permanently, the vehicle would have been the most logical means of doing so. Its untouched state suggested he never intended to go far, at least not that day. As hours turned into night, the mountains around Silver Plume did what they always do after sunset. Temperatures dropped sharply, visibility decreased. Trails that were manageable in daylight became hazardous in darkness. If Keith had wandered beyond town limits, the environment would have shifted quickly from contemplative to unforgiving. Still, there was no sound, no call for help, no indication of struggle or accident that reached the town below. By the next day, it was clear that Keith Reinhard was missing. Not late, not delayed, missing. What made the situation so troubling was how complete the disappearance was. There was no single decision point investigators could identify, no moment where intent shifted into danger. One day, Keith was walking through Silver Plume as he had many times before. The next, he was nowhere to be found. The day he vanished left behind a landscape of ordinary details: a parked car, a rented room, a quiet street, frozen in place. Nothing moved forward, nothing resolved. It was as if time stopped around his absence, leaving everyone else to move on while the question remained unanswered. How does a man simply step out for a walk and never come back? That question would soon pull Silver Plume into an expanding search, one that would comb the mountains, examine every reasonable possibility, and still come away empty-handed.
Once it became clear that Keith Reinhard had not returned and could not be accounted for, concern in Silver Plume shifted into action. What began as quiet unease turned into an organized response, shaped by the understanding that time mattered, especially in a mountainous environment. Keith Reinhard was reported missing after friends and residents recognized that his absence no longer fit the pattern of solitude that defined the town. This was not a case of someone avoiding contact. This was a man who had left behind his car, his belongings, and his daily routine. Local authorities were notified, and the seriousness of the situation was immediately understood. In a remote mountain town, unexplained absence carries a different weight. Exposure, injury, and disorientation are not abstract possibilities, they are known risks. Initial efforts focused close to town. Law enforcement and local volunteers began checking areas Keith was known to frequent. Roadsides, paths near residences, and nearby open areas were searched first. His room was examined. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing suggested struggle, panic, or preparation. From the outset, investigators were confronted with a lack of starting points. There was no last known destination, no confirmed trailhead, no timeline beyond the general window of the previous day. This absence of anchors made even the earliest stages of the search difficult. As concerns spread, more people became involved. Locals who knew the terrain offered assistance. Volunteers familiar with the mountains joined efforts, understanding that even a short walk could lead into dangerous territory. Search areas expanded outward from Silver Plume, following logical paths a person on foot might take. Despite these efforts, the search produced no immediate results. No footprints, no dropped items, no disturbed vegetation that could be confidently linked to Keith.
The ground in many areas was rocky or forested, offering little in the way of trackable evidence. Authorities had to balance urgency with realism. Searching too narrowly risked missing a wider movement. Searching too broadly risked diluting limited resources. Decisions were made based on probability, terrain, and accessibility. Weather conditions added pressure. Mountain weather is unpredictable, and each passing day increased the risk that evidence, if it existed, would degrade or disappear. Rain, wind, and temperature changes could erase signs almost as quickly as they formed. As hours turned into days, the scope of concern widened beyond the town itself. Keith had no history of sudden disappearance, no known reason to abandon his life without explanation. The longer the search continued without results, the more unsettling the silence became. What stood out most was how completely the landscape resisted giving anything back. In many missing person cases, early searches at least confirmed direction, a trail, a location, a boundary crossed. Here, there was nothing. The mountains offered no confirmation that Keith had even entered them. This absence of evidence did not slow the search. If anything, it intensified the resolve to keep looking. But it did begin to reshape expectations. The case was no longer just about finding a person. It was about confronting the reality that someone could disappear entirely, even with immediate concern and organized response. The search for Keith Reinhard had begun in earnest, and almost immediately it revealed how little the investigators had to work with. What followed would test the limits of manpower, terrain, and certainty itself.
As the search for Keith Reinhard intensified, attention shifted decisively from the town of Silver Plume to the mountains that encircle it. This transition marked a turning point in the investigation, where uncertainty met terrain that offered few concessions to human effort. By this stage, authorities and volunteers understood that if Keith Reinhard had wandered beyond town limits, the search would be dictated less by intention and more by geography. The surrounding landscape was vast, uneven, and resistant to systematic coverage. Each ridge, gully, and tree line represented both a possible path and a potential dead end. Search teams expanded outward using established protocols. Likely routes were prioritized first: paths leading from town, natural corridors through the forest, and areas accessible on foot without specialized equipment. Teams moved in grids where possible, but the terrain often made strict patterns impractical. Steep inclines, loose rock, and dense vegetation broke continuity, forcing searchers to adapt constantly. Helicopters were deployed to survey broader areas from above. From the air, the Rockies reveal scale that is difficult to grasp from the ground. Forest canopy stretches uninterrupted for miles. Shadows pool in ravines. Rock faces blend into one another. A human figure, even if present, would be nearly impossible to detect unless in open terrain. Search and rescue teams worked with urgency, aware that time in the mountains is unforgiving. Even in late July, temperatures at elevation can drop sharply overnight. Exposure remains a serious risk, particularly for someone unprepared for an extended stay outdoors. Each passing day increased concern, but it also complicated the search as potential evidence degraded rapidly. Despite thorough efforts, nothing surfaced. No clothing, no personal effects, no signs of recent movement. Dogs trained to track scent were brought in, but scent trails in mountainous environments are fragile. Thin air, wind currents, and rocky ground can dissipate or scatter scent quickly, rendering tracking inconclusive. Volunteers who knew the area remarked on how easy it would be for someone unfamiliar with the terrain to become disoriented. Trails that appear clear can narrow abruptly or split without signage. Descents that feel manageable on the way down can become dangerous when attempting to climb back up. Landmarks shift depending on angle and light. Orientation is easily lost. The search was not confined to easy terrain. Teams checked ravines, creeks, and areas where an accidental fall might occur. They examined places where a person seeking solitude might stop to rest or think. They followed logic and probability, but logic alone cannot account for every human movement, especially one shaped by introspection rather than destination. What made the search particularly challenging was the absence of a confirmed entry point into the wilderness. There was no known trailhead where Keith was last seen. No witness could say definitively which direction he took after leaving town. As a result, the search area expanded rapidly, becoming difficult to contain. Coordination among agencies was steady, but resources were finite. Every additional day required reassessment: where to search next, what areas had already been covered sufficiently, and when diminishing returns began to outweigh continued expansion. These decisions are among the most difficult in missing person cases, especially when there is no evidence to suggest whether the subject is alive or deceased. As days passed with no findings, the emotional toll on those involved became evident. Searchers confronted not only physical exhaustion, but the unsettling possibility that the mountains were withholding something permanently. In wilderness searches, discovery often brings resolution, even when the outcome is tragic. Here, there was nothing to resolve. The absence of evidence did not confirm a single theory. It did not prove that Keith had fallen, succumbed to exposure, or intentionally disappeared. It simply reinforced how completely a person could vanish once absorbed by rugged terrain. Eventually, the search effort reached a point familiar in many wilderness cases. Areas had been checked multiple times. Probability zones had been exhausted. Continued searching yielded no new information. With no tangible leads, the operation could not continue indefinitely at full scale. The mountain search for Keith Reinhard ended not with answers, but with limits. Limits of visibility, of access, and of certainty. The Rockies had offered no confirmation that he was there, and yet no evidence suggested he was anywhere else. What remained was a haunting imbalance, a search thorough enough to inspire confidence in the effort, yet empty enough to provide no conclusion. Keith Reinhard had entered the margins of the landscape, and the mountains had kept their silence.
As the active search for Keith Reinhard slowed and eventually ceased, investigators were left with an absence that was as significant as any physical discovery could have been. In many missing person cases, even when outcomes are tragic, something remains behind: a piece of clothing, a personal item, a disturbed area of ground that confirms direction or fate. In this case, there was nothing. The investigation into the disappearance of Keith Reinhard was defined not by what was recovered, but by what was never found. No clothing belonging to Keith was located in the surrounding wilderness. Search teams did not recover shoes, fabric, or any item that could be conclusively linked to him. In mountainous terrain, clothing is often the first indicator discovered, either caught on vegetation, exposed by weather, or revealed during ground searches. Here, there was no such trace. No personal effects were found. No notebook, no writing materials, no wallet, no keys. These items, had they been dropped or discarded, would have offered clues, a direction of travel, a resting point, or a moment of decision. Their absence suggested either that Keith never carried them far from town, or that they were never recovered despite extensive searching. No remains were discovered. This fact would come to weigh heavily on the case. Even decades later, hikers and searchers would find nothing connected to Keith Reinhard. In wilderness disappearances, remains are sometimes located years later due to erosion, animal activity, or chance encounters. In this case, time offered no revelations. There were also no signs of a struggle, no disturbed ground near town, no indications of violence, no reports of suspicious activity involving other individuals. From an investigative standpoint, this significantly narrowed and complicated possible explanations. There was no evidence pointing toward foul play, but the absence of evidence did not conclusively rule it out either. Keith's room remained undisturbed. His belongings were intact. There was no sign that he had packed, sorted, or intentionally left items behind as part of a planned disappearance.
His car remained parked and unused, reinforcing the conclusion that whatever happened occurred on foot and within a relatively close radius of Silver Plume. The lack of physical evidence also limited forensic possibilities. Without items recovered from the field, there was nothing to analyze for biological material, damage, or environmental indicators. Investigators could not reconstruct a path or sequence of events because there were no artifacts to anchor that reconstruction. This vacuum of evidence forced authorities to rely almost entirely on circumstance and probability. Where might a person walk from town? How far could someone go without supplies? What risks would they face? These questions guided theory, but they could not replace proof. What made the absence particularly troubling was the thoroughness of the search effort. This was not a cursory sweep. The area around Silver Plume had been examined repeatedly. Teams had covered terrain that matched likely human movement patterns. Aerial surveys had scanned open areas, yet nothing emerged. In some cases, investigators eventually conclude that evidence was missed early on. In this case, there was no clear indication that such a failure occurred. Conditions were not ideal, but they were not catastrophic. The search began relatively quickly. Experienced personnel were involved. Still, the mountains yielded nothing. As time passed, the absence of evidence began to shape the narrative of the case. Rather than narrowing possibilities, it expanded them. Without physical confirmation of death or survival, every theory remained provisional. Accidental death could not be confirmed. Exposure could not be proven. Voluntary disappearance could not be substantiated. Foul play could not be demonstrated. This uncertainty is one of the most difficult aspects of unresolved cases. Evidence typically guides closure. Here, its absence preserved ambiguity. For friends and those who followed the case, the lack of discovery became its own form of trauma. There was no place to mourn, no location to mark, no definitive moment when hope could be replaced with certainty. From an investigative perspective, the case of Keith Reinhard stands as a stark reminder of the limits of search and technology when confronted with rugged wilderness. Even with manpower, aircraft, and local knowledge, the environment can absorb a person completely. What was never found became the most powerful fact of all. No trace, no proof, no conclusion. Only a name, a place, and a silence that refused to break.
With no physical evidence to confirm what happened to Keith Reinhard, investigators were left to evaluate possibilities rather than conclusions. Each theory emerged from documented facts, environmental realities, and established patterns in wilderness disappearances. None could be proven. None could be fully dismissed. What follows are the primary explanations considered over time, presented without endorsement, speculation, or embellishment. The first and most immediate theory examined was accidental death. In mountainous terrain like that surrounding Silver Plume, accidents do not require extreme behavior. A misstep on uneven ground, a slip on loose rock, or a fall into a concealed ravine can occur without warning. Even experienced hikers are vulnerable. Keith was not documented as undertaking a technical hike, but even a short walk off established paths can lead into hazardous areas. The absence of remains complicates this theory, but it does not eliminate it. In rugged wilderness, a body can be concealed by terrain, vegetation, or seasonal conditions for decades. Closely related is the theory of exposure. Mountain environments are deceptive, particularly at high elevation. Temperatures can drop rapidly after sunset, even in summer. A person dressed for a casual walk can become hypothermic within hours if conditions change. Disorientation, fatigue, and impaired judgment can follow quickly. Exposure deaths often occur quietly, without dramatic signs. Again, the lack of physical evidence prevents confirmation, but exposure remains a documented risk consistent with the setting and timeline. Disorientation itself was also considered as a distinct possibility.
Wilderness disorientation does not require panic or irrational behavior. A person can become turned around gradually, especially in forested areas where landmarks repeat and trails fade. Thin air and physical exertion can further impair orientation. If Keith wandered beyond familiar areas while thinking or walking, it is possible he lost his sense of direction without realizing it until it was too late. Disorientation can lead individuals deeper into terrain rather than back toward safety, compounding risk. Investigators also considered the possibility of voluntary disappearance. This theory arises in cases where individuals leave behind belongings and are not recovered. Keith Reinhard had expressed a desire for solitude and personal re-examination, which some interpreted as a potential motive for intentional disappearance. However, there is no documented evidence that he planned to abandon his identity or start a new life. He left behind his car, possessions, and writing materials. He made no known arrangements for money, shelter, or support elsewhere. Voluntary disappearance cannot be ruled out, but it lacks corroborating evidence. Foul play was examined and largely deprioritized due to lack of indicators. There were no signs of struggle, no reports of suspicious individuals, and no evidence of violence. Silver Plume was, and remains, a small community with limited transient traffic. While the absence of evidence does not conclusively eliminate foul play, there is nothing in the record to support it as a leading explanation. Investigators found no motive, no suspect, and no physical trace pointing in that direction. Another possibility considered was medical emergency. Sudden health events such as cardiac incidents or neurological episodes can occur without warning, even in relatively young individuals. If such an event happened while Keith was alone in a remote area, it could have resulted in collapse without opportunity for assistance. As with other theories, the absence of remains prevents confirmation or denial. Less commonly discussed, but still documented in investigative reviews, is the possibility that Keith entered an area that was searched but not effectively visible. Terrain complexity means that even thorough searches can miss locations that are obscured from view. Steep inclines, overhangs, dense undergrowth, and natural debris can conceal a person completely. Search operations rely on probability, not certainty. This reality does not imply error, but it does define limitation. Throughout the investigation, authorities remained cautious about assigning weight to any single theory. The lack of evidence did not justify narrowing the case prematurely. Instead, the case remained open-ended, with multiple explanations held simultaneously. What complicates interpretation is the alignment between Keith's personality and the environment he chose. He sought solitude, not danger, reflection, not disappearance. That alignment makes accidental or environmental explanations plausible, but it also prevents simple narratives. There was no dramatic turning point where intent shifted toward risk. Theories were revisited over time as new cases and research emerged. Comparisons were drawn to other wilderness disappearances, some of which were resolved years later through chance discoveries. Others remained unsolved indefinitely. Keith Reinhard's case fit uncomfortably into both categories. Importantly, investigators did not conclude that Keith wanted to disappear. They did not determine that he died. They did not assert certainty where none existed. The official posture of the case remained one of unresolved absence. This restraint matters. It reflects the reality that evidence, not assumption, defines conclusions. In the absence of proof, the case could not be closed with confidence. What remained after all theories were considered was a narrow truth. Keith Reinhard vanished under circumstances that allowed multiple explanations, none of which could be confirmed. The mountains offered no answers, the evidence did not speak, and the case continued forward not as a solved mystery, but as a collection of unanswered possibilities, held together only by documented fact and the limits of certainty.
As weeks turned into months and months into years, The disappearance of Keith Reinhard gradually shifted from an active investigation to an unresolved case sustained more by memory than by momentum. This transition did not occur because authorities stopped caring, but because the case encountered limits that could not be crossed without new information. The most significant factor was the complete absence of physical evidence. Investigations are propelled by material anchors, a location, an object, a confirmed event that narrows uncertainty. In Keith Reinhard's case, there were none. No trail, no remains, no personal effects. Without evidence, investigators could not establish a definitive timeline beyond the day he was last seen. Without a timeline, leads could not be prioritized. Without leads, progress stalled. Jurisdictional constraints also played a role. Silver Plume is a small town with limited local resources. While initial search and investigative efforts were supported by broader agencies, long-term cases require sustained funding, personnel, and justification. As time passed without discoveries, the case no longer met the criteria for continuous active deployment of resources. This is a reality faced by many missing person investigations, particularly those involving wilderness. Law enforcement must balance ongoing cases against new emergencies. When a disappearance produces no new information after exhaustive early efforts, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify reallocating manpower indefinitely. Another factor was the lack of corroborating witnesses. Keith Reinhard was known, but not closely monitored. His solitary nature meant that few people could speak with certainty about his inner state or intentions in the days before he vanished. There were no recorded conversations that suggested urgency, fear, or imminent change. Without witness testimony pointing toward a specific direction or decision, investigators had little to follow. The environment itself contributed to the case going cold. Wilderness does not preserve evidence in predictable ways. Weather, wildlife, and terrain continuously alter the landscape. Over time, even if evidence once existed, it may have been destroyed or rendered indistinguishable from its surroundings. Each passing season reduced the likelihood that something new would surface. Technological limitations of the late 1980s also shaped the investigation's trajectory. There were no cell phones to track, no GPS data, no digital footprints. Keith Reinhard's movements were not recorded electronically. His absence left no trail of signals to reconstruct. What today might generate data points then produced only silence. As years passed, the case became dependent on the possibility of chance discovery. Hikers occasionally find remains decades after disappearances. Construction projects uncover forgotten evidence. In some cases, a single accidental find reactivates an investigation. But chance cannot be scheduled or predicted. Without it, cases like Keith's remain suspended in uncertainty. The absence of foul play indicators further complicated the case's longevity. Investigations involving violence often remain active longer due to public safety concerns and the potential for repeat offenses. In this case, there was no evidence of criminal involvement. That absence reduced urgency from an institutional perspective, even as it deepened the mystery. Public attention also diminished over time. Without developments to report, media coverage faded. As public awareness declined, so did the likelihood that new witnesses would come forward. Silence compounded itself. Importantly, the case was not formally closed. It remained unresolved, open in the sense that no conclusion had been reached. But unresolved does not mean actively investigated. The distinction matters. The file existed, the questions remained, but the mechanisms of inquiry slowed almost to stillness. For those who followed the case, this stagnation felt deeply unsatisfactory. There was no resolution to accept or reject, no confirmed outcome to process. The lack of closure extended not only to Keith Reinhard's fate, but to the narrative of the case itself. The investigation did not fail in a dramatic sense. It reached the boundary of what could be known without new input. That boundary is where many wilderness disappearance cases end, not with answers, but with exhaustion of possibility. What made Keith Reinhard's disappearance particularly enduring was not just that it went cold, but why. It went cold because there was nothing left to pursue, no thread to pull, no evidence to reinterpret, no mistake to correct. The silence that followed was not indifference, it was the consequence of limits.
human, institutional, and environmental. Limits imposed by terrain that does not reveal what it takes. Limits imposed by time that erases what little remains. And so the case entered a long, unresolved pause, not solved, not forgotten, simply waiting for something that might never come.
Decades after the disappearance of Keith Reinhard, the case continues to exist not as a collection of answers, but as a series of unresolved questions. These questions persist because they are grounded in documented absence, gaps that no investigation, search effort, or passage of time has been able to close. One of the most enduring questions is why Keith's belongings were left behind. His room in Silver Plume remained intact. His books, clothing, and writing materials were undisturbed. There was no indication that he had selected items to take with him or discarded others intentionally. For someone whose life revolved around thought and writing, the absence of even a fragment of explanation is striking. It leaves open the question of intent. Did he expect to return shortly? Did he underestimate the risk of a simple walk? Or did events unfold too quickly to allow for reflection or preparation? Equally persistent is the question of direction. Where did Keith go after he was last seen walking in town? Without a confirmed trailhead or destination, every possible route remains hypothetical. The mountains surrounding Silver Plume offer countless paths, many of which diverge subtly before becoming isolated and difficult to retrace. A single wrong turn can place a person beyond easy recovery within minutes, yet no evidence confirms that he entered the wilderness at all. The lack of a clear starting point remains one of the case's most troubling aspects. There is also the question of scale. How far could Keith have traveled on foot, dressed casually, and carrying no supplies? Some theories suggest he could not have gone far before encountering serious difficulty. Others point out that motivated individuals can cover surprising distances, especially when moving without a fixed goal. Without physical markers, distance becomes speculative, and speculation cannot replace evidence. Why were no traces ever found? This question carries weight because extensive searches were conducted, not just once, but repeatedly. The absence of clothing, remains, or personal effects challenges assumptions about how the wilderness interacts with human presence. In some cases, even minimal evidence eventually surfaces. Here, nothing did. The mountains did not return what they took, if they took anything at all. Another unresolved question concerns timing. What happened in the critical hours after Keith was last seen? Did he encounter trouble quickly, or did he wander for an extended period? Did nightfall play a decisive role? Without a timeline, these questions remain unanswered. The lack of witnesses during that window leaves a void that cannot be filled retroactively. There is also the question of choice versus chance. Was Keith's disappearance the result of a single decision, stepping off a familiar path, lingering too long, misjudging distance, or a chain of small, ordinary choices that compounded into irreversible consequence? Many wilderness accidents occur not because of dramatic errors, but because of subtle miscalculations. Without evidence, the distinction remains unknowable. Some ask why the mountains have never given him back. Over time, erosion, animal activity, and human movement often reveal what was once hidden. Yet years passed without discovery. This absence fuels speculation, but speculation cannot substitute for fact. It only reinforces how completely the environment can obscure human presence. There is also a quieter, more human question that lingers. Did Keith find what he was looking for? He came to Silver Plume seeking clarity, meaning, and solitude. The disappearance interrupts that search abruptly, leaving it unresolved. His inner journey, like his physical one, ends without conclusion. The case also raises broader questions about vulnerability. How easily can a person vanish, even when they are not trying to? Keith Reinhard was educated, intentional, and cautious by reputation, yet those qualities did not protect him from disappearance. The case challenges assumptions about safety, control, and predictability in natural environments. For investigators, the lingering questions are procedural as well as personal. Was every area searched thoroughly enough? Were assumptions made too early or too late? Could anything have been done differently? These are inherent to unresolved cases, but without new evidence, they remain theoretical. What makes the questions surrounding Keith Reinhard particularly enduring is their resistance to narrative closure. There is no single mystery to solve, no final reveal waiting behind one overlooked detail. Instead, there is a constellation of uncertainties, each connected to the others, none dominant enough to resolve the whole. The questions persist because they are rooted in absence, and absence does not age the way evidence does. It does not degrade. It does not clarify. It simply remains. Keith Reinhard's disappearance continues to exist in that space between what is known and what can never be confirmed. The questions do not fade, they accumulate. And with each passing year, they become less about solving a case and more about acknowledging the limits of understanding. The mountains remain. The town remains. The silence remains. And the questions do too.
The disappearance of Keith Reinhard endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is unresolved in the most complete sense. It offers no conclusion to accept, no evidence to reinterpret, no final chapter to close. Instead, it remains suspended, a story defined by quiet choices, vast landscapes, and unanswered questions. Keith Reinhard came to Silver Plume seeking something that cannot be measured or easily described. He was not chasing spectacle or escape, he was searching for clarity, meaning, and a way to align his inner life with the world around him. In choosing solitude, he followed a path taken by many thinkers and writers before him. What distinguishes his story is not that he sought silence, but that the silence ultimately kept him. Over time, his disappearance has become part of Colorado's long history of unsolved wilderness cases. The mountains are indifferent to intention. They do not distinguish between those who come prepared and those who come merely to think. They do not mark moments of transition or turning points in a person's life. They simply exist, vast, complex, and resistant to narrative. Keith's case challenges the assumption that disappearance requires motive or intent. There is no evidence that he wanted to vanish. There is no proof that he met with violence. There is no confirmation that he died. What remains is the unsettling reality that a person can step into a natural environment, even briefly, and leave no recoverable trace. The legacy of this case is not one of fear, but of humility. It reminds us of the limits of control, of how easily certainty dissolves when evidence disappears. It highlights how modern systems, search operations, investigations, documentation can still reach a boundary beyond which they cannot proceed. For those who study missing person cases, Keith Reinhard's disappearance stands as an example of how environment shapes outcome, not through malice or chaos, but through scale and silence. It underscores why wilderness cases remain among the most difficult to resolve, and why closure is not always possible even with diligent effort. For those who reflect on Keith as a person rather than a case, his story carries a different weight. He was a man in transition, engaged in the universal human act of reassessment. He sought to strip life down to essentials. What happened next stripped the story itself of resolution. There is no place to visit that definitively marks his last step, no artifact that explains his final decision, no document that reveals what he was thinking as he walked that day. His inner journey, like his physical one, ends without witness. And yet, his name persists. It persists because unresolved stories resist disappearance in their own way. They linger in archives, in conversations, in the memories of those who encountered them. They remind us that not every question is answered, and not every life leaves behind a clear ending. Silver Plume remains what it has always been, a quiet mountain town where silence stretches for miles. The Rockies still rise around it, unchanged by time or inquiry. People still walk those streets and trails, often unaware of the story absorbed into the landscape. Keith Reinhard's disappearance does not offer a lesson in certainty. It offers a lesson in restraint, in acknowledging what cannot be known without forcing meaning where evidence does not exist. He came seeking clarity. What remains is ambiguity. And perhaps that is the final truth of this case,
that some searches do not conclude with answers, but with the recognition of limits, of knowledge, of reach, of resolution. Share this story. Keep his name alive, because somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, the truth about Keith Reinhard still waits.